She was born beneath a golden ceiling. The palace nurse wrapped her in silk, whispered blessings, and handed her to a queen who refused to look. The midwife hesitated. The infant's features, slightly slanted eyes, a soft fold in her palm, a quiet calm in her cry, spoke of something unspoken, and in the stifling hush of royal chambers, silence was never innocence. This was not the heir they had prayed for. In royal courts obsessed with lineage, beauty, and the illusion of perfection, the birth of a child with Down syndrome was not merely a private sorrow. It was a threat, a scandal, a ghost to be buried before it breathed too loudly. These children, born into power but denied its promise, were locked behind velvet curtains and high walls. Their names were stricken from records, their portraits never painted. To the world, they never existed. But they did, and their stories matter. Their fate was written not by their condition, but by the fear of those who loved titles more than truth. Throughout history, the body of a royal child was more than flesh and blood. It was a national emblem, a divine sign, a political asset, a weapon of symbolism. A crooked tooth could stir rumors. A limp might inspire rebellion. So what happened when the child was born different? Not flawed, not broken, simply different. In centuries past, Down syndrome had no name. Its signs were visible, but its causes were unknown. A flat nasal bridge, upward slanting eyes, a softer tone to muscles, slower speech, delayed movement. All of these marked a child for suspicion. Without medical understanding, whispers filled the void. Some said it was God's punishment. Others blamed the mother. Some called it a curse in the bloodline. In monarchies built on the myth of divine right and hereditary strength, difference was danger. A disabled child could unravel dynasties, stir gossip in courts, or cast doubt on the purity of a family's power. So the illusion was maintained at any cost. Nurses sworn to secrecy, servants paid to forget, and children, babies, taken away in the night to quiet corners of abbeys, estates, and institutions. Out of sight, out of history, their only crime was being born human. Nerissa was born in 1919. Catherine followed 7 years later. They were cousins of Queen Elizabeth II, part of the extended Windsor line, and heirs to centuries of noble blood. But they were not raised in royal nurseries. They never walked the polished halls of Buckingham or waved from balconies in silk. Instead, their childhoods were spent behind locked doors, inside the Royal Earlswood Institution for Mental Defectives. From the moment their disabilities were noticed, believed to include Down syndrome or similar conditions, their fate was sealed. Not with cruelty, but with something colder, abandonment cloaked in respectability. They were declared dead while still alive. Official royal records listed their deaths falsely in the 1940s, even though they remained at Earlswood for decades. Nurses recalled that Nerissa rarely received visitors. Her wardrobe consisted of second-hand clothes. Her identity as a royal was not known to those who cared for her. She died in 1986. Catherine lived until 2014. It wasn't until journalists uncovered their existence in the late 1980s that the world learned what had happened. Outrage followed, but the monarchy remained largely silent. These were not forgotten cousins. They were deliberately buried, alive, silent, unseen. In the age of cameras and coronations, the truth still didn't fit the frame. Born in 1915 to the German Crown Prince Wilhelm and Duchess Cecilia of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, Alexandrine of Prussia had what many others did not, a name that was not hidden. She lived in the royal household. She appeared in some family photographs. Her face, gentle, smiling, unguarded, was printed on postcards, shared with the public in quiet defiance of the norms. But Alexandrine was never included in royal duties. Her presence, while acknowledged, was carefully managed. She did not speak at ceremonies. She attended a special school, kept from the public roles her siblings embraced. Her life was dignified, but still shadowed. Loved perhaps, but never fully embraced. She died in 1980, her memory preserved not in scandal, but in silence. Even in this gentler treatment, the message echoed the same. A royal child with Down syndrome could exist, but never shine. Before the term Down syndrome was coined in the 1860s by British physician John Langdon Down, such children were labeled in cruel, archaic terms, idiots, imbeciles, or worse, but the condition itself is ancient. Paleopathologists have identified skeletal remains of individuals with Down syndrome dating back thousands of years. It has always existed. What changed was society's response, especially among elites. Royal families, already terrified of madness and misfortune, treated visible disability as evidence of rot in the blood. A healthy heir was a future. A disabled child was a liability, so they were erased. In monastic records, vague mentions appear of noble infants given to God, of children sent away for healing, euphemisms for exile, occasionally whispers of worse, infants smothered at birth, deaths blamed on fevers or weakness. No autopsies, no public mourning, just a shuttered window, a forgotten cradle. She was not born into a royal palace, but she entered a world just as bound by image. Anne de Gaulle was the youngest daughter of Charles de Gaulle, the towering figure of France, war hero, future president. She was born in 1928 with Down syndrome. But instead of being sent away, Anne was kept close. Her parents, Charles and Yvonne, defied the expectations of their time. They raised her at home, not in an institution. Charles was said to have adored his daughter, holding her hand through quiet walks and whispering stories as she laughed. She had difficulty speaking, but when she smiled, he called it light in the darkness. Still, France never saw her. There were no photos in the newspapers, no speeches mentioning her name. Anne lived largely in the shadows of public life, hidden not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear of public misunderstanding, of ridicule, of a legacy being tarnished by love. She died of pneumonia at age 20. Charles de Gaulle, a man forged in battle, wept for the first time in front of his aides. Years later, Yvonne would found a hospital in Anne's name, a refuge for children like her. It was a quiet act of penance, a monument of love built in a time of silence. If these are the stories we know, what about the ones we never will? Before the 20th century, the existence of royal children with disabilities was nearly always buried beneath euphemism and ash. The further back we look, the less remains. Not because it didn't happen, but because it was never allowed to be written. Across medieval Europe, the birth of a royal child with deformity or cognitive delay could be interpreted as a bad omen, God's judgment, or the devil's mark. Monarchs were believed to be chosen by divine right. To birth a child with an unexplained condition was to question that divinity, so the response was brutal. Some were sent to remote estates. Others were confined in monasteries where vows of silence ensured they would never speak to outsiders. In a few documented cases, infants disappeared entirely. Midwives reported stillbirths, but with no witnesses, who could say? One 17th century French court document alludes to a daughter born with features unpleasing to God, dispatched quietly to the nuns of Montreuil. Her name was never recorded. In Russia, the Romanovs were rumored to have hidden several children with deformities or intellectual disability in the countryside. In Spain, Habsburg chronicles list births that end abruptly in records, often paired with vague terms like defective or afflicted. No burial sites, no portraits, just absence. The walls of European castles hold echoes of cries no one was meant to hear. In Austria, the Schönbrunn Palace once held a chamber at the far edge of the estate, never marked, never shown to visitors. Servants whispered that it was where a distant cousin lived. She had moon eyes and spoke to herself in nursery rhymes. Some said she was a niece, others said she was a punishment. In England, the country estates of lesser royals sometimes became quiet prisons. Children with Down syndrome were brought there with a retinue of nannies, governesses, and physicians, but no tutors, no lessons in governance, no preparation for court, only time, silence, and the illusion that they'd never been born. The public image of monarchy depended on perfection, and so these children became secrets, wrapped not in blankets, but in shame. They were called blessed innocents by sympathetic clergymen, but more often they were spoken of as stains, mistakes, divine warnings. And when they died, they were buried without nameplates, without titles, often without mourners, forgotten by the very blood that birthed them. What made the treatment of these children so cruel was not just the silence, but the hypocrisy. Monarchs claimed divine right. They crowned themselves with crosses, ruled in God's name, and filled their palaces with chapels. And yet, when faced with a child born different, perhaps the truest embodiment of divine vulnerability, they turned away. Religious texts called the meek blessed, but courts called them embarrassments. In royal families, appearance was power, and a child with Down syndrome shattered that illusion, not because of any failure of theirs, but because the world was not ready to see nobility in imperfection. The irony is unbearable. In trying to preserve the myth of perfect blood, many monarchs destroyed the proof that love, kindness, and humanity had ever touched their lineage. The cost of their silence was measured not just in forgotten lives, but in what those lives could have shown the world about grace. The 20th century promised science, progress, compassion, but for many royal children born with Down syndrome, the shame remained, only hidden under clinical words and cleaner walls. Institutions like the Royal Earlswood Hospital in Britain or similar facilities in France, Germany, and Austria became the new castles of silence. Children were dressed, fed, and cared for, but they were not loved in the way the world loves a prince or princess. They had no titles, no celebrations, no inclusion in royal archives. In public, monarchs stood on balconies with their perfect heirs. Behind closed doors, other children, just as royal, just as worthy, were kept out of sight. The dignity they were denied came not from malice, but from something far colder, the belief that they didn't belong. The lives of Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon are not unique. They are simply the few whose records escaped the fire. There were likely hundreds, if not thousands, of royal children across Europe whose birth was never announced, whose death never mourned. We will never know their names, but we know what they suffered. Not violence, not hatred, but the slow death of being forgotten while still alive. Today, the world is changing. Children born with Down syndrome are no longer hidden. They walk red carpets, attend schools, fall in love, and speak proudly for themselves. They are actors, teachers, business owners, activists. They are daughters and sons who are cherished not in spite of their differences, but because of them. We now know that Down syndrome is not a curse. It is not a punishment. It is not a flaw. It is simply a difference, one of the many that make up the human experience. But this understanding is painfully new. It blooms from soil soaked with centuries of silence. By telling the stories of Nerissa, Catherine, Alexandrine, and Anne, by speaking the names of those who were denied that dignity in life, we do more than remember. We reclaim. We resist erasure. We say, you lived, you mattered. You were not a shame. You were never a mistake. And we say it not just for the children of kings and queens, but for all children who were once hidden, abandoned, or erased simply because they were born differently. Because history owes them more than silence. They were born into palaces but never saw the throne room. Their names were written in royal ledgers, then quietly crossed out. Their cribs stood beside golden ones, but theirs were wheeled away in the night, down corridors of secrecy and shame. They never led armies, never held court, never wore crowns. But they bore the weight of an empire's fear, and in that weight, they taught us something royal families never intended to learn: that perfection is a lie, and humanity is what remains when power turns its face away.